Good evening, gentlemen, and only 15 minutes late. Let us begin by reviewing what we discussed in last week's class. Last week's class, we began Tanya chapter 1, very exciting, the first chapter of the Tanya. And we discussed how immediately, and really this even began earlier on the Tanya's title page and in the publisher's foreword, compiler's foreword, But in chapter 1, even further, the idea that the Alter Rebbe is telling the person who's seeking his advice to turn inward. We go to the Rebbe, we come to the Alter Rebbe with inner questions. We come to him with questions that really cannot be answered at the superficial level, because the Jew who's coming to the Alter Rebbe with questions is a Jew who keeps the Torah's commandments, more or less, does good things, is a fundamentally good person in terms of their behavior. Otherwise, they wouldn't be coming to the Alter Rebbe. They wouldn't have needed to come to the Alter Rebbe because the answers to their problems they would have found elsewhere. This is a person who's learned, who's studied a lot of Torah and studied what to do. Because again, if they didn't study what to do and they didn't improve their behavior, they would never have made it this far to the Alter Rebbe. They would have asked someone in their town where they were from, they would have asked someone, any Jew, what's the right way to live, and that Jew could have taught them, right? That Jew could have taught them that we pray 3 times a day, and we do this mitzvah, and we do that mitzvah, and this is what the Torah says in its ethical teachings, right, about how a person should behave. This Jew learned all those things, and yet they still come to the Rebbe. They still come to the Alter Rebbe with questions. What's their question fundamentally? Their question fundamentally is, how do I reach God? How do I take this behavior and this changing of my action, which seems relatively easy, and make of it something that's authentic, an authentic relationship with the divine, where my thought, speech, and action are united with my heart in one cohesive whole, in one integrated Jewish reality, rather than feeling like I'm the same person I've always been, but some days I do good things and some days I do bad things, or I've always been improving in the good things that I do, but the good things that I do really don't seem to change who I am. This is the type of question that the person comes to the Alter Rebbe with. And the Alter Rebbe's advice at every step, at the beginning of his answer, which is what the Tanya is the Alter Rebbe written down and given over, the Tanya is the answer of the Alter Rebbe to these questions. At every step, the Alter Rebbe tells the person to turn inward. They have to turn inward towards themselves. And how does the Alter Rebbe illustrate this from the beginning of the first chapter? Because he cites a Gemara, and he brings from the Talmud a whole statement about the promise that the soul gives before it's born, to be righteous and not be wicked. But even if the entire world tells you that you are righteous, you must be in your own eyes as wicked. This is what the Talmud says. And as we explained last week at length, this is a very seemingly bizarre statement, a bizarre teaching of the Talmud. It's bizarre on multiple levels. The first thing that jumps out is that we're clearly making distinctions between, as we spoke about last week, different levels of the person, right? There's what the person is, there's how people tell them they are, how they're perceived from the outside, and then there's how they're supposed to view themselves, which already adds a tremendous depth to the Jew's religious experience. It's not just one-dimensional. There's all of these rich dimensions and layers and registers at which the Talmud is telling him how to be. And then more specifically, we asked the 2 questions of the Alter Rebbe that he asked actually in the text, which are, number 1, this appears to be a textual contradiction to what it says in Pirkei Avos. In Pirkei Avos it says, do not be wicked in your own eyes. And at least according to the commentators that read it this way, this is a contradiction to what our Gemara said in the famous Gemara brought as a Tanya, which we also mentioned last week, that if you open a Gemara, you won't find that it says Tanya there for various reasons. See last week's class. Seemingly it says in Pirkei Avos, in the Ethics of Our Fathers, do not be wicked in your own eyes. So we have a simple textual contradiction. The Gemara is sending us mixed messages. Which one is it? Should it be that if the whole world tells me I'm wicked, tells me I'm righteous, I should view myself as wicked? Or should I not view myself as wicked in my own eyes? Both of these things being strange ideas, again, relative to what I truly am, right? The Torah makes the soul make a promise to be righteous. So theoretically, the soul can keep the promise. The soul can be righteous in this world. But even if it's righteous, apparently it's not supposed to view itself as righteous. Or maybe it is, depending which source you're looking at. These sources need to be reconciled. We have to figure out a way to explain both of these sources. The second question, which is what we ended last week's class with, was really a question from Svara. It was a question from reason, which we only mentioned briefly. Talk about a little more now, which is, if a person views themselves as wicked, right? And it goes without saying. I think I mentioned last week, but just in case, I'll say it now. I can't remember. It goes without saying that if the Torah tells a person to view themselves as wicked, this is, of course, the correct thing to do. In other words, the person is not, if the Torah tells you to always view yourself as wicked, it's because you are wicked. The Torah is not advising you to lie to yourself. So in other words, even though you fulfilled the promise to be righteous, you should always look at yourself as wicked because there's something missing even in your fulfillment of that promise, of that oath, whatever that means, right? Which is part of our general question here, which is, what does that mean that I'm righteous, but I'm also supposed to view myself as wicked, right? So the Alter Rebbe says, on the one hand, if the person views themselves as wicked, at the Torah's behest, meaning they recognize that they are and remain, no matter how much they think they fulfilled that oath and were righteous, they do remain to some extent wicked in some way. If a person views themselves like that, they fall into sadness. It makes the person sad. Because fundamentally, it seems that this is a very despairing position. In other words, no matter how righteous I am, there's no real success in being righteous. There's no way of actually being truly righteous because I'm supposed to always look at myself as wicked. A person that always looks themselves as wicked and believes it, in other words, they're not fooling themselves, they believe that there's some aspect of them that is always wicked, seemingly will fall into despair, or will fall into a state of sadness, and we're supposed to serve God with joy, as will be discussed at much greater length later in the Tanya, and is of course a pillar of the entire Hasidic way of life, is to be joyous. I was considering whether to tell a story or not, but I don't think I will. I know, but not all of them are appropriate for the class, let's put it that way. And the second half of the question, the second, what would you call it? The other horn of the dilemma, right? The other side of the fork is that if a person does not view themselves as wicked, but they actually are, this brings a person to kalos reish, which is apathy or disregard. They'll be frivolous with their spiritual state, right? In other words, if they don't view themselves as at all wicked, even though they are, then they're not going to take that reality seriously. They're never going to think about it, and when they don't think about it, on the contrary, that wickedness has the power to overwhelm them. And so it comes out that you have it would seem, and this is really the Alter Rebbe's question, it seems that the Torah puts even the righteous in a bind, right? The righteous are trapped, because no matter how righteous they are, they're always supposed to view themselves as wicked. Which means that really there is some aspect of them which remains wicked. But if there is some aspect of them which remains wicked, then either they acknowledge that fact and live in an eternal state of sadness and dejectedness because they can never actually reach the goal of actually being completely righteous to the extent they're not supposed to view themselves as wicked, on the one hand. Or, on the other hand, they could ignore that advice, not view themselves as wicked, and in that case, who knows what the wickedness that's still within them could get up to. It could break out, make trouble, and they could eventually no longer be righteous. Right? So in other words, the Talmud seems to present, at least at its surface, in Sfara, a very dour picture. Not dour, I don't mean in tone necessarily, although there could be that too, because in tone there's always questions of interpretation, right? But rather in logic, right? Logically, it seems that the person will always be struggling. That's really the point, the main point here, in my opinion. The main point is that this person will always be struggling, even though they were made to give an oath that they would be righteous, and even if they fulfill that oath when they come into this world and live their life, they will always, always, always be struggling one way or another. They cannot, it seems that they cannot win, or they cannot really fulfill the oath that they are given, which is the gist of this question. Now, the answer to the textual question will be found in chapter 13 of the Tanya. So we'll get back to that much later. The answer to the more subtle, or whatever you want to call it, the more the sort of logical problem, right, of the person is in this bind. The Torah puts a person in this state where they don't seem to be able to really win. It's actually a question where it's answered in Tanya. It's far less clear where in the Sefer this answer is. Although in chapter 31 and chapter 34, seems to be the framework of the answer. The Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, I don't know if you know this, so I'll mention it now, that some of the things that we'll be teaching as part of this class, I'm putting this class together based on primarily two Svarim which are commentaries on the Tanya. There's the Chassidus Mevu'eres Tanya, which is a set of black books in Hebrew, and there's also Pninei Tanya, which I like very much, which has a bit more of the Fabrengen aspect, let's put it that way, a bit more of the Chassidus Mevu'eres is very deep and analytical and precise and rigorous, and the Pninei Tanya is much more broad, based more on the general ideals of Tanya, so to speak, and has a lot more like stories and like connection to other Hasidic notions and other Hasidic ideas and things like that. And I feel like between these two Svarim, you cover a lot of the spectrum, right? And then in between, I'll maybe add some of my own, as any teacher, I suppose, must inevitably, right? So I may as well embrace it. I'll add some of my own thoughts, etc. On what we're learning. Really, my own struggles with trying to understand the Tanya is really what it is. So one of the things that's quoted in all commentaries on the Tanya, of course, because it's from one of the Rebbeim, is the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, the Alter Rebbe's grandson, whose Maimer we learned in this class a long time ago, Mitzvahs Hamanas Alakus, right, from Derech Mitzvah. So he wrote chapter summaries on many of the chapters of Tanya, and they serve as kind of like a commentary, because they're not just summaries, they're really sort of more elaborate on certain ideas that are within the text, and you learn a lot of the intricacies of Tanya from this. And the Tzemach Tzedek wrote about this part of Tanya that it's not clear where the answer to this question, this logical question the Alter Rebbe asks, is in the Tanya, and the Tzemach Tzedek says for an interesting reason, because of the Arichas HaDvarim, I believe is the, I may have written the exact quote. Yeah. Arichas HaDvarim, Arichas HaInyan maybe, I didn't write the exact language, because of the length of the answer to this question in Tanya. In other words, it seems that the answer to this question has to be gleaned from many chapters or from a long portion of the Tanya, and therefore it's not so clear where exactly the answer is. In other words, it's one of these things where, in some sense, a large portion of the Sefer seems to answer the question automatically, even though there is no one place, like the textual question, where you can point and say, oh, this is where the Alter Rebbe is going to answer the question. I just wanted to give you the heads up. So the first question is only in chapter 13 that we're going to get our clear answer. So we see here immediately one of the famous structural ways of viewing the structure of the Tanya, which the structure of the Tanya is something that there are itself lessons about and books about. Rabbi Shais Taub famously made the Tanya map, the map of Tanya. So the first 12 chapters, under many of these divisions, are seen as very important, as a fundamentally the basics of the basics of Tanya is the first 12. And so you can see why, because in chapter 13 is only when the first question asked in Tanya gets answered. So there's 12 chapters of information, and then we start answering the first question, and the Alter Rebbe proceeds forth with his highly structured explanation. I'm sure as people in this class remember from when we learned Shar Yichud V'Emunah, the second part of Tanya, that if a person is paying attention and learns carefully, the Tanya is an incredibly organized and well-structured sefer. It follows a very logical progression and flow from one thing to the other, such that if a person learns it really well, they shouldn't even really need to memorize what's in each chapter, because really everything is in its right place, right? It's like if you know the logical structure of a thing, right, like the rooms of a house or something like that, you don't really have to memorize it. It's just the way that it obviously goes, right? So those are the two questions we finished class with last week. This week we are going to continue chapter 1. We are about to introduce the famous concept with which the Alter Rebbe continues to develop his theme of the first chapter. The first chapter is basically divided into two halves, so we're still right at the beginning of the first half. The second part of the first half, which we're going to start tonight, is where the Alter Rebbe builds up a whole structure of questions pertaining to the five different categories of Jew, which there's two types of tzaddik, there's two types of righteous, there's two types of rasha, there's two types of wicked people, and there's the Beinani, who's the intermediate man. And those who remember our class on reading the title page will remember that on the title page of Tanya, the Tanya is called the Book of the Beinani. So it should be like a big flashing red light when Alter Rebbe begins to talk about the Beinani, because we know that this is somehow mysteriously connected to the Alter Rebbe's purpose for the entire work. And what the Alter Rebbe basically does, as I hope to show in tonight's class, and we'll continue it next week, God willing, I doubt we'll finish this in tonight's class, but what the Alter Rebbe does is similar to his first question. So it's interesting because the questions come in tiers. It's very interesting. The Alter Rebbe doesn't just ask all the questions in one go, right? The Alter Rebbe, all the questions that begin Tanya, they come in drips and drabs. They come in little bushels, that the Alter Rebbe sends out a few questions, and then it seems there's more discussion, and then there's a few more questions. And the Alter Rebbe is building in Nigla de Torah, really, in the revealed aspect of the Torah. There's one Zohar, so technically it's cheating. It's not all the revealed aspect of the Torah. There is one Zohar. But even if you didn't bring that one Zohar, the Alter Rebbe is still building a system of questions, textual questions, based on trying to understand various primarily Talmudic sources, right? And the gist of all of these questions, the theme, is the same theme we've already introduced to the first chapter. The theme of all of these questions is that clearly you cannot read the Talmud's classification of Jews in a superficial manner. It's going to be clear from various textual difficulties, right? The contradictions may be too strong a word, but from various textual difficulties and difficulties in understanding the message of the Talmud, what's going to come out is that we need to totally revamp our way of reading the Talmud. If we read the Talmud at the superficial level, the way it describes Jews, we are led into a whole mass of contradictions, a whole way, basically a dead end where we can't seem to understand the way the Talmud describes Jews. And this is going to be a stepping stone for the Alter Rebbe to introduce his understanding of what a Jew is, which again lasts about 11 and a half chapters. And by the end of that explanation, we'll have all the tools we need, having explained at every level what a Jew is, what a Jew has, what a Jew does, etc. By explaining that at every level, we'll be able to answer all these questions and understand the sources, right? So even though the Alter Rebbe is going to be introducing a radical, fresh, new way of understanding what the Jew is, a profoundly Hasidic way that did not exist, that was not revealed, we should say, before the Baal Shem Tov. If to the extent that it existed, it was not a major focus, right? The Baal Shem Tov brought it into focus and made it a pillar of the whole Judaism, the principles that we're going to learn, right? And even though these principles are radically new and radically fresh, as is the custom of Chassidus, we use them to answer textual questions that are as old as Judaism itself. In other words, In other words, the whole this goes back to one of the other themes of Tanya. We've already explained that the whole Tanya is founded on trust of the Rebbe, fundamentally, right? So the whole approach, and very common in Hasidic discourses, and sometimes it's hard to be refined enough as a student to appreciate what's going on in this sense. But you have a Hasidic discourse typically begins with questions on some pre-existing text or teaching, a relatively long intersection of the discourse, which seems to talk about something totally unrelated and very abstracted, very lofty. And at the end, you get the answer and the resolution to the questions raised at the beginning of the mimer, which sometimes, to students who are coarse, like I am, we sometimes have the question of, this all seems very like tacked on, right? Clearly you had the middle of the discourse, and then questions were found and answers were sort of connected so that there could be a beginning and an end to the discourse. And what is this whole forming about? And you were going to see it in chapter 1 of Tanya. The whole first half of the first chapter of Tanya is all just textual questions. There's no great new idea. It's all questions and struggling with these texts, right? But you see here that the whole approach of Chassidus is founded on the purest Jewish faith, which means that the Hasidic teachings are only ever an extension of the Torah that the Jew that is coming to the Rebbe has already received, which is more important than it may seem at first. In other words, what the Alter Rebbe is saying at one level, one explanation of this, what the Alter Rebbe is saying is that I'm not just here to give you advice, let's put it that way. I'm not just here to answer your question only in the way that you've asked it. I am going to reveal to you a new level of the Torah, right? Which is vitally important because the Torah is the inheritance and the possession of this Jew already, right? In the sense that, again, this Jew that's coming to the Alter Rebbe already possesses Torah. They already know something. They've maybe already studied. They have a heritage. They have a fundamental connection to the Torah. And the Alter Rebbe is saying that what I'm going to give you speaks to your soul, like we said in the introduction to Tanya, right? Because it's an extension of Torah. The reason that this advice is going to be pertinent to your soul is because your soul is one with Torah, and this advice is all just an extension of, a revelation of what's really in the Torah already. So it's very, very important to the Alter Rebbe, and I'm not saying this is the reason, but perhaps it's a reason. It's very, very important that the teachings of Tanya arise as answers to questions in Torah that every Jew already possesses, right? The Alter Rebbe is going to come say things in Tanya which a Jew could say, maybe this doesn't belong to me. What's the connection between me and this Torah? Alter Rebbe is saying, no. If you want to understand your own Gemara, your Gemara that you inherited as your birthright when you were born, right? I'm going to help you understand that Gemara. This teaching is not from the outside, as it were. I'm not coming as a stranger, so to speak, and offering you this teaching. Right? I'm not coming as parochial, as we said in the foreword. Right? I'm coming as someone who knows you already. Where do I know you? I know you in your very soul. And I'm going to bring this teaching down to your soul as it is. It's going to come from the Torah that you already possess, not as a something new to you, but rather as growing from within, something that you already own and maybe even know. So let's read. We are in chapter 1 of Tanya, which is on page Hey of the Kutei Amarim. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines down. We got up to the first period in Tanya, where you see it, Kalus Chas V'Shalom. All right, about 7 lines down into chapter 1. We are starting Acha Inyan, which in the English is, however, the matter will be understood after a preliminary discussion. That's what we're up to in the English, third paragraph in the English translation. We are using, for those who are tuning in for the first time, joining us for the first time, we are using the old standard English translation of the Tanya, not the lessons in Tanya, the one that translates 1 page is Hebrew, 1 page is English. It's the third paragraph of that English text we are going to be beginning with. Acha inyan, however, the matter will be understood as follows. This is a terminology, just like we discussed last week, tzarich lahavin, we need to understand, right? Which is Chassidus' way of asking a question, not the thing doesn't make sense, but rather we need to understand, which reflects Chassidus' humility. The answer to tzarich lahavin in Hasidic discourses is often acha inyan. However, the matter is as follows, right? Which is interesting, because it doesn't say the answer is or the explanation is. It simply says, however, the matter is as follows, which also reflects the Hasidic way of learning, the Hasidic approach to learning Torah, which is that we are not learning what we're going to learn to answer our question. Because to learn it only to answer our question is at some level, again, perhaps presumptuous or mixing my own limitations into the thing, right? It's almost like saying we need, the thing doesn't make sense, is saying the answer to our question is, right? Rather, what does we say? Acha inyan. However, the matter is as follows, which means we're going to learn a whole matter, self-contained, in other words, for its own sake, so to speak. But from learning this concept, our questions will answer themselves, right? The questions will be answered by learning this other thing first. What are we going to learn? We find in the Gemara, that is the Talmud, 5 chalukos, 5 different types, 5 categories of Jew. What we mean by types or categories will become clear. Where do we find this in the Gemara? It's on Brachas, Tractate Brachas 7a and 61b. And the commentaries on the Tanya say, why does it say matzinu, we find in the Gemara, rather than the more common language of it's brought in the Gemara, isa b'Gemara, it's brought, because it's not brought. The Alter Rebbe is presenting a synthesis from 2 different sources, and he is making the synthesis. So in other words, in the precise language of Alter Rebbe, it's matzinu, we find. In other words, what comes out, if you learn both of these 2 sources in the Gemara, is the following synthesis. The Alter Rebbe is putting it together for us, right? It doesn't say, if you go and look in the actual place in the Gemara, it won't say there's 5 categories. You have to learn both places and put them together, and then you come to the following 5 types. What are the 5 types? Sadiq v'tovle, Sadiq v'rale, Rasha v'tovle, Rasha v'rale, ubenani. You have a tzaddik and it is good to him. I'm trying to translate very literally. We'll read the English translation in a second, which is interesting. Tzaddik v'rale, you have the righteous and it's bad to him. Rasha v'tovle, the wicked and it's good to him. Rasha v'rale, the wicked and it's bad to him. Ubenani, and you have an intermediate person. These are the 5 distinctions. Now, the translation here is the translation appropriate to where this is actually discussed in the Gemara. There's a reason to translate the righteous and it's good to him, which we'll see in a little bit, why it's good to translate it more literal. But really what it's discussing in the Gemara there is as is translated here. They translate a righteous man who prospers, a righteous man who suffers, a wicked man who prospers, a wicked man who suffers, and a Beinani, an intermediate person. The Talmud is discussing, and really now on whatever number time learning the first chapter of Tanya I'm on, this strikes me as more and more fascinating the more times I learn it. The Tanya on its very first page of chapter 1 is referencing one of the most famous religious questions of all time, which is, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper in God's world? And this question, astoundingly, and the reason it's astounding is because if you don't even know what's going on here, it can just totally slip by you because it's just quoted from the Gemara, and as you'll see, the question itself is almost irrelevant to the Alter Rebbe's purpose. I say almost, but really, not really. Nothing is by accident, of course. But the Alter Rebbe is bringing the Gemara, which references one of the most fundamental religious questions that there are, and it's fascinating because the Alter Rebbe is not going to address that question as you may assume he would. That question is almost not going to be addressed if at least maybe not in the whole Tanya, might be too hasty, but certainly not here. right? The Gemara is discussing the question, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper? So the Gemara explores this question. If you go learn these Gemaras, you'll see that there's an exploration. There's famous answers which you may have heard before in the name of the Talmud, and it's from these sources. So one of the propositions of the Gemara is that the reason righteous people suffer is because there's a difference between a righteous person who's the child of a righteous person versus the righteous person who's a child of a wicked person, and vice versa. In other words, the merit or demerit of their parents affects their lot. So even though they're righteous, their parent wasn't righteous, and that can affect, that's why you have a righteous person who suffers. That's one proposition of the Gemara, which it doesn't really, I think, survive the discussion there, but it's one idea. There's a different opinion from Rabbi Meir, which is very famous, which is that, on the contrary, this is a secret that no human being has ever really known, right? There's a famous discussion about how God offers to show this to Moshe Rabbeinu, and Moshe Rabbeinu refuses. Moshe doesn't want to see, right? This is the whole thing about the burning bush, right? That's what God is offering to show Moshe Rabbeinu at the burning bush, because the whole question at the burning bush is the people have been suffering in slavery in Egypt, and where has God been, right? So God offers to show Moshe Rabbeinu the secret of secrets, so to speak, why the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper, and Moshe Rabbeinu refuses. He doesn't want to see it. There's an opinion which is that this secret was never revealed. No one has ever really known the answer to this question, Rabbi Meir says, and don't expect any answer anytime soon, right? And then the Gemara says the answer is that there's a different, we're going to say what the answer is. Then the Gemara gives an answer, right? So you have this question produces 5 different types of people. Really, you would think 4, but a 5th one slips in. You have the righteous who are prosperous, the righteous who suffer, the wicked who are prosperous, the wicked who suffer, and then you have the Beinoni, the intermediate man who at first glance or intuitively is neither righteous nor wicked, he's somewhere in between. Yep. Upirshu b'Gemara, the Gemara explains why you have these different categories. What's the Gemara's answer? Tzadik v'tovle, tzadik gamur. Tzadik v'rale, tzadik she'enei gamur. The Gemara explains that a righteous person who prospers is completely righteous, is tzadik gamur. Whereas a righteous person who suffers is incompletely righteous, tzadik she'enei gamur. Right? In other words, the simple reading of the Gemara, before we get to anything else, the simple reading of the Gemara is that the reason the righteous suffer is because they are not fully righteous. It's very simple. The reason the wicked, the reason the righteous do not prosper, right, and the reason the wicked do prosper is because they're not completely wicked. And in fact, there's the explanation famously is, I believe, as brought by the Maharsha, and as is expounded on in I would say at greater length in non-Hasidic works, right, is the opinion of the Maharsha, the commentary of the Maharsha, who comments on this Gemara. One of the most famous and ubiquitous commentaries on the Gemara is the Maharsha. The Maharsha says that it's actually counterintuitive, the reason why the righteous suffer in this world. The righteous suffer in this world, why? So that their reward in the world to come, in Ilam Haba, after they pass away, apparently, would be, I assume, is the meaning of the Maharsha. Their reward in the next world will be pure and unsullied, will be totally a pure reward, right? In other words, God detracts from the rewards they get in this world, so they suffer here, so that they won't suffer there. So in other words, if you're righteous, God is going to reward you in the world to come. Any type of righteous. If you're imperfectly righteous, how does he have to make that reward a pure reward? By making you suffer here, right? So in other words, if you're righteous enough to get reward in the world to come, you'll suffer in this world for all of the imperfections in your righteousness, so that God can reward you justly and purely in the world to come, right? And with the wicked, it's the opposite. Why do the wicked prosper? Because if a person is generally wicked, then they're going to suffer in the world to come, in the afterlife, right? And the reason why they prosper in this world is so that, on the contrary, their suffering can be complete in the world to come, right? In order to have justice, they have to use up all of the whatever good they have here in terms of their reward here, so that in the world to come, their suffering can be complete, right? Anyone who's familiar with Hasidic teachings will understand that the Alter Rebbe is going in a totally different direction with all of this. Because, and really, it's not even a side point, really it's directly pertinent to the whole theme of our chapter as we've been discussing, because we're going to see that the definitions of righteous and wicked cannot possibly be that a righteous person does mostly good things and some bad things that have to be burned away in this world, and the wicked person does mostly bad things but maybe some good things, and his rewards have to be burned away in this world. We're going to see that it's almost impossible to read the full view, the consistent view of the Gemara in this way, right? And in fact, as the Alter Rebbe has insistently been saying with every word of the Tanya, we're going to have a much deeper and a more inner, is really the term, as I was ranting last week, the difference between the inner reality and the outer reality. We're going to have an inner reality understanding of what these things mean if we really want to make sense of the Gemara. Which is another important point, which is that the Alter Rebbe and all Hasidim believe that the Torah was mystical all along. In other words, that the Torah has to really explain the Torah without any contradiction. The inner world is the only recourse. There are some questions which can only be answered with recourse to the inner secrets and the inner realities that the Torah describes. We also notice here, this is for connoisseurs, I'll mention parenthetically, we also notice here that there is, as you'll see, even though the Maharsha is describing a spiritual reality and an inner reality are not necessarily the same thing. Just because we're describing the world to come, which is a spiritual reality, right, which is a non-physical reality, non-physical is not the same thing as the inner mystical perspective. And in fact, they can be at deep opposition one to the other. In a sense, as we're going to learn, it's better to be non-spiritual if you're going to be non-mystic than to be spiritual and non-mystic, which is really the quality of Avodah Zarah and idol worship and all sorts of other not nice things, as we'll see as we go through Tanya. At some level, there's reasons to say the opposite as well, and it's a whole, as we'll see, it's a whole thing. This is the simple meaning of the Gemara, as the Maharsha explains it. The simple meaning of the Gemara is that the reason the righteous suffer is simply because they're not completely righteous. There's still some wickedness left over, which should immediately call to mind what we learned last week, right? The beginning of this chapter, that even though he's given the vow to be called to be righteous, and even though the whole world calls him righteous, he should still always realize there is some wickedness within him, right? So there seems to be an immediate connection and resonance with the very first Gemara that's brought in the Tanya, right? And now we're going to continue to explain. Rayamahamna, in the Rayamahamna is Aramaic for faithful shepherd, a term you may have heard before. Rayamahamna is the name of a section of the Zohar. Rayamahamna is like a sub-book of the Zohar. If I'm not mistaken, it's that section of the Zohar which elaborates on the meaning of the mitzvahs. Right? There's a Sefer HaMitzvahs. Many different great rabbis wrote Sefer HaMitzvahs. The Rambam has a Sefer HaMitzvahs, right? Where he explains the meaning of the mitzvahs, the number of the mitzvahs, etc. And the Zohar also has a Sefer HaMitzvahs. The Zohar also explains a number of the mitzvahs. What's interesting is that some of what the Rambam writes appears to be a direct quote of the Zohar, which is very interesting because many people are of the opinion that the Rambam never studied the Zohar. You're going to have to go get their opinion on how that's possible, because there's a tradition from the Baal Shem Tov and among all Hasidim, and this is one of the real outstanding, what would you call it, academic debates, maybe you could say in the history of modern Judaism, which is everybody wants Maimonides to belong to them, basically, right? Everyone says the Rambam was just like us, and the reason everybody's able to say that is because the Rambam was so complex and so rich, and there's so much to the Rambam, of course. And the Hasidim, for their part, are no different, and they say that the Rambam was at least at the end of his life, very familiar with Kabbalah and was a Kabbalist and a mystic, and studied the inner secrets of the Torah. Other groups who are not so into Kabbalah and mysticism say that, on the contrary, the Rambam is what he appears to be at first glance, which is Judaism's arch-rationalist, to which the Hasidim would say, we thought that the arch-rationalists of Judaism were defeated by the Maccabees on Hanukkah. But that's a different story. Anyway, the Rayamahamna says, Parshas Mishpatim, on Parshas Mishpatim, Pirush, it explains, Tzaddik v'raloi, what's the term Tzaddik v'raloi, which we were translating as the suffering Tzaddik, Shehara shebei kafuf l'toiv, that the wickedness within him, how do they translate? His evil nature is subservient to his good nature. His kafuf is like subjugated. Is bowed over, is overpowered by, is subjugated to the goodness within him. So the tzaddik, the righteous person, v'ralai, and it is bad to him, and this is why I was translating literally, because the Zohar reads differently. The Gemara, tzaddik v'ralai, the people who read the Gemara at the simple level say tzaddik v'ralai is a righteous person who suffers. The Zohar says, no, it's not talking about suffering. It's talking about the inner state of the tzaddik. Note that we are immediately pointing towards inner realities, which is what you would expect from the Zohar, because the Zohar is the inner Torah, right? What does it mean, tzaddik v'ralai? Tzaddik v'ralai literally means a righteous person and wickedness is to him. That's the literal translation, right? So the Zohar reads it with the question, how could you be righteous but have wickedness to you, right? Which is the apparent question, right? If it means suffering, there's no question, and it's a different thing, right? He's righteous, but he suffers, right? But if you say it's a tzaddik v'ralai, it means he's righteous, but there's wickedness to him. So if he has wickedness, how can he be a tzaddik? So the Zohar answers, that's the implicit question, the Zohar answers, what does it mean, tzaddik v'ralai? The wickedness within him is subjugated to the good within him. Which means he has wickedness, whatever that means. He possesses it in some way, or wickedness is associated with him in some way. But that wickedness is subjugated to the good within him. In other words, that wickedness has no control or dominion. It's totally subservient to his goodness, right? And the Zohar then explains, tzaddik v'tovle, a tzaddik and it's good to him means there's no wickedness at all, right? There's a tzaddik who has wickedness, but the wickedness is totally subjugated to him. And then you have a tzaddik that has no wickedness at all, which if you think about it, is again, this is a subtlety, this is a deepening of our vision, right? Because if you view a righteous person simply by their deeds or their behavior, right, then this fine distinction is not really possible to make. Right? In other words, if I do 612 mitzvahs and one mitzvah I don't do, so there's righteousness in 612, and then there's wickedness in the 613th, and it's not that there's no relationship between the 613th and the 612, right? These are good, and it's very like black and white, right? I'm 612 out of 613 parts good, one part bad, right? And that one part bad is why I suffer in this world, so that I can get all my suffering out here, so I can get my pure reward for my 612 in the world to come. The Zohar says, but that doesn't make sense, because you can't divide. These are my words speaking, right? I'm saying this, not the Zohar. But from the inner perspective, you can't divide righteousness and wickedness in a person in this way, right? It's not just a percentage. Why so quantitative, right? Why so quantitative? Is our experience of righteousness and wickedness, inner righteousness and wickedness, a mere experience of two quantities persisting, like sand in a jar, that some percent one color and some percent a different color. That's not the experience of the inner world of righteousness and wickedness. So rather, these terms are describing something more subtle, right? A righteous person is a person that either has no wickedness, or the wickedness is totally subjugated to their good. That's how you can have a tzaddik, but with wickedness to him. He has wickedness, but that wickedness is in a state or in a relationship which, again, in the pure, simple, superficial, quantitative division does not exist, right? It doesn't really make sense. His wickedness is subjugated to his good. It's in a certain state, a certain relationship with the goodness that's within the tzaddik. And of course, the Zohar explains the Rasha the same way, right? A Rasha that has goodness, right, means there's a wicked person who goodness is he has goodness within him. It's there, it's associated with him, but it's subjugated in its relationship to his wickedness. It serves his wickedness. It can't escape. It's totally subjugated to his wickedness. And the Rasha Virale, the Rasha and its bad to him, doesn't have any goodness at all. Right? And the Beinoni apparently is someone in the middle, whatever that means. So the Zohar already introduces this concept of the inner reality. It's more a question of the inner soul state of the person, rather than merely some percentage of their behavior is good and some percentage is not good. So the Zohar introduces this idea. It should be pointed out that this doesn't necessarily reject the idea, by the way, of the tzaddik, the righteous person who suffers, the righteous person who doesn't suffer. In fact, they could be the same explanation. They could all be connected. In other words, the Zohar, it could be read as saying that it's the tzaddik who still has wickedness within him, even though it's subjugated to good, and because he still has that wickedness within him, that's why he suffers, right? And vice versa. The bad person, even though the goodness within him is totally subjugated to the bad, nevertheless, whatever that presence is, it's enough that he should prosper in this world. In other words, it's not a rejection necessarily of that reading, it's just maybe a deepening of that reading. These divisions of tzaddik and rasha, as explained in the Zohar, is going to be explained more by the Tanya later in chapters 10 and 11. We're going to get later to these divisions more, of how the Alter Rebbe views the tzaddik and the rasha and the Beinoni, of course. But more on the Beinoni presently, shortly. But Gemara, Saf Perek Testa Brachas, in the Talmud, at the end of the 9th chapter of Brachas, this is page 61b of Brachas. Tzadikim yetzer tov sheftan, chulu rishayim yetzer hara sheftan, beinanim zev v'zeh sheftan. There it says that a tzaddik is someone who is judged by his good inclination. The wicked are judged by their evil inclination, and the intermediate are judged by both. Now, there's a lot to unpack here. First of all, what are these inclinations? This is really a question that will be dealt with later in Tanya. Really, what are these inclinations? So we'll set aside that for the moment, the full richness of that question. We'll discuss that more in its place. We'll say for now that we'll read it at the simplest level, right? How you would teach a child about the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara, which is that a person has an inner desire to do good and an inner desire to do wickedness, right? Kind of like the angel and the devil on each shoulder, right? It's the simplest way of reading it, right? So now you have this question of what does it mean judges them? Right, this is a common confusion at this point, and it's going to be discussed more in Tanya as well later. This whole idea of judgment, you have to think of a Jewish court, not of Judge Judy, right? In a Jewish court, the whole idea of a judge is someone that tenders an opinion, right? And majority rules. In other words, if you have a Jewish Beis Din which has 3 members, right, and it goes up from there, 3 members is the smallest Beis Din. So you have a Beis Din which has 3 members. Right? And the question is who is the one that gives that offers their opinion in this situation? Right? That's what we mean by judges. We don't mean they give the final decision, that they rule over the person, which is what you would think from like Judge Judy, who is judge, jury, and executioner. We mean instead, like on a Jewish court, right? It means they give their opinion, right? So the righteous person, it says later in the Gemara, the tzaddik is someone who only the good inclination gives the opinion, only the good inclination is speaking in the ear. The rasha is only the wicked inclination, and the Beinani both speak. That's what the Gemara says, which you immediately see, even without what the Zayar said. You immediately see that even the Gemara itself is referring to inner states of the person, right? In other words, if a tzaddik was all about doing 613, for example, right, that seems to not explain the magical mechanism where a rasha can become a tzaddik, and thereby the one voice goes quiet and the other voice starts speaking, if you understand what I'm saying. In other words, we're describing the inner state of the person. So if it's all behavioral, right, if you take a behavioral approach, like they did at some point in psychology to the great detriment of civilization, right? If you have a pure behavioral approach where you don't believe in any inner state and you just judge the person by externalities, by the external superficial view of how they behave, it's unclear what the Gemara could even mean, right? That this one has this voice speaking to him and this one has a different voice speaking to him, right? In other words, so if I go from a rasha to a Beinani to a tzaddik, it can't just be in the way I behave, because it's meant to be describing inner persuasions or inner inclinations that are taking place within what we would dare call the psycho-spiritual makeup of the person. You have these different voices, these different influences. So how could it be that this simply describes behavior? In fact, it seems the opposite. It seems to have little to do with behavior, because which voice you listen to is not what's at question here. It's not about which voice you listen to, it seems. It's about which voices are speaking, right? Which voices are the ones that are giving you advice. So even in the Gemara, we see this more inner perspective. Evening. This Gemara continues. We'll read it just a little more and then we'll finish. We are over time. This Gemara continues with now a famous discussion that everyone remembers from when they first learned the first chapter. Tanya, Amar Rabba said, Kagain ana Beinani. I, for example, am a Beinani. Amar le Abaye replied to him, Le shavik mar chaye l'chol beria, which they translate here as, Master, you do not make it possible for anyone to live. And so on. So this Gemara continues, this Gemara which implies that Tzaddik, Rasha, and Beinani are more profound than mere behavior. And here we see an even more bizarre description about the nature of the Beinani, right? Where the nature of Tzaddik and Beinani really is what's under discussion, although as we'll see in one interpretation, even the Rasha is kind of implicit here, right? That Rabbah says, I, for example, am a Beinani. And Abaye replies to him basically that if you're a Beinani, then there is no hope for the rest of us, right? Rabbah was a complete tzaddik and the foundation of his entire generation. Tzaddik Yesod Elam, the tzaddik is the foundation of the world. And if you're not a tzaddik, if you're a Beinani, what does that make the rest of us? And there's different ways to read the statement of Abaye. The simple way is the way according to Rashi, which is that basically this leaves us all in a state of eternal striving. In other words, if you weren't able, that's how Rashi reads it. If you're a Beinani, that means no one can be a tzaddik. So we've all failed. That's basically, or we're all going to fail indefinitely. There's no hope for the rest of us to ever achieve the level of tzaddik because you're only a Beinani and we can't be like you. So basically, that means there are no tzaddikim, is basically what the Rebbe seems to be saying at the simple level. The Rebbe's father reads slightly differently. He says, if you're a tzaddik, then if you're only a Beinani, then what does that make the rest of us? It makes the rest of us Rashayim. And a Rasha, what's a Rasha? A Rasha is dead even while they're alive. A Rasha is in a state of spiritual death. right? And in fact, the Gemara says that a Rasha, all Rashayim inherently are deserving of capital punishment. The Rasha is in a state of either spiritual or even physical suspended death. The Rasha is in a state of death already. Right, so Rabbah, by saying he's a Beinani, implies that everyone else is wicked, and the wicked are already in a state of death. There's a third way to read it, which is that if Rabbah is saying he's a Beinani, which means he's not a Tzaddik, and we say Tzaddik Yesod Ilam, every generation has its righteous people who are the foundation of the whole earth, and in whose righteousness all of existence, in whose merit all of existence persists, right? So if he says he's not a tzaddik, really that means that by all justice, God should just take the whole world is doomed, right? Because there is if he's not even righteous enough to be a tzaddik, then really none of us have any chance. So the implicit question here, even before the Alter Rebbe gets into more of the details of this a little later, as we're going to read next week, God willing, the implicit question here is, if the difference between tzaddik and Beinani is a superficial difference, why is Rabbah convinced that he's a Beinani and not a tzaddik? In other words, as we're going to read the question later, how can Rabbah think that he is a Beinani if, in Abaye's opinion and in truth, in actuality, he is a complete, as the Alter Rebbe is going to demonstrate from another Gemara we'll read next week, if he actually is a tzaddik, how can he think that he's a Beinani? Which just further attests to our continuing theme of all of these questions, which is that we're going to have to understand these terms in a less superficial manner. We're going to have to turn to the inner world, the inner reality of the Jew, to understand these terms, as we will continue next week, God willing.